No one had seen the dead-eyed bounty hunter weep until she sang to his horse. The horse went lame outside Cimarron on a Thursday. That's where this starts, not where I wanted to, but that's the truth of it. A pulled tendon in the left foreleg, and Reaper, I called him that because the livery man in Dodge told me I'd named him wrong, that a horse that color deserved something better, and so naturally I kept it. Reaper went down to 3 legs in a creek bed 2 miles short of town, and I stepped off and stood in the water with my boots filling up and looked at him, and felt the particular kind of tired that goes past the body. I'd been trailing a man named Denton Briggs for 11 days. 11 days through country that hadn't made up its mind whether it was still winter, or had given up on being anything at all: gray sky, gray rock, the occasional patch of dirty snow in the shade of a bluff. Briggs had killed 2 men in Pueblo for their payroll and a third in passing, just because the man looked at him wrong over a fence post, and the mining outfit that hired me wanted him back alive, which was the harder job, the one that costs more and pays less than you'd think given the difference in difficulty. I was cold, and I hadn't slept more than 4 hours together since I left, and I had 11 days of thinking about Denton Briggs behind my eyes, and then my horse went lame in a creek. I'm not a man who talks to animals. I've known men who do, men who narrate their whole day to a horse like the horse is keeping notes, and it always struck me as a kind of loneliness that had curdled into something else. But I put my hand on Reaper's nose that afternoon, there in the creek, and I didn't say anything, and he breathed on my palm, and I stood there longer than I needed to. I led him into Cimarron on foot. The town was the kind of town that exists only to give travelers a reason to stop and spend what they have before moving on. A main street, a hotel with a porch that needed fixing, 2 saloons, a dry goods, and a church at the far end that looked like it had been surprised to find itself there. I took Reaper to the livery, explained the tendon to the man there, a heavy-set Mexican named Bernal who knew horses the way some men know weather, and he looked at the leg and said 7 days, maybe 10, don't push it. 10 days. I had $3 and change. I had Denton Briggs 11 days ahead of me, or wherever he'd scattered to by now, and I had 10 days in a town I'd never meant to stop in, watching what money I had dissolve into hotel meals and a stall fee for a lame horse. I got a room. I sat on the edge of the bed and I looked at my hands and I thought about nothing, which is what I do when I don't want to think about the things I'd have to think about otherwise. I was 44 years old. I had been doing this work since I was 22, after the war wound down and there wasn't anything else that would have me, and I found I was good at finding men who didn't want to be found. $1,200 a year average when times were decent. No wife, no land, 1 horse, a wanted Dodger tucked in my inside coat pocket where other men keep letters. That's not self-pity, that's inventory. The preacher's wagon came in the next morning. I was on the hotel porch with coffee when they rolled up the street. A canvas-sided wagon with a cross painted on the side in fading white. A second wagon behind it carrying what looked like folded lumber and crates, and a string of 7 or 8 people on horses and walking alongside. The kind of traveling Salvation outfit that moves circuit through the territories, setting up a tent for 2 nights, taking the collection, moving on. I'd seen them before. Mostly I'd seen men use them as cover to get through rough country, women use them out of genuine need, and the preachers themselves use them for reasons I'd stopped trying to sort into good and bad. I didn't look long. I finished my coffee and went back upstairs. But that afternoon, with nothing to do and Briggs lost to distance, and the room starting to feel like a small wooden box, I walked down to the far end of town to check on Reaper. Bernal had put him in the corner stall with extra hay and a poultice on the leg that smelled of camphor and something else I couldn't name. Reaper was standing with his weight off the bad leg and his head low, not in distress, just resting in that animal way, somewhere behind his eyes that I'll never have access to. I stood at the stall door. And then from somewhere outside, from behind the livery, I thought, or from the churchyard, I heard singing. Not him singing the way I'd heard it in towns, the stiff congregational kind where everyone holds the same note for dear life. This was one voice, a woman's, and she was singing something slow and real, and the notes bent at the end of each phrase like she was feeling her way through the dark to the next one. I couldn't make out words at first, just the shape of it. Reaper lifted his head. He turned it toward the wall where the sound was coming from, and his ears went forward, and he stood like that, weight still off the bad leg but his head up, attentive, present in a way he hadn't been when I came in. I don't know why I didn't leave. I stayed by the stall door and I listened. The song came around a second time and I could make out the words now, something about a river and a crossing and the far shore, and the woman's voice did something on the word crossing that I can't describe properly. It broke almost, but not in a bad way, more like a door opening that had been stuck. Reaper stretched his nose toward the wall. I stood there like an idiot with my hat in my hands. When the singing stopped, I went outside and around the back of the livery, and she was there, sitting on the top rail of the fence that ran behind the building, her back to me, looking out at the scrub. She was maybe 35, maybe a little older, hard to tell from behind. Brown hair pinned up but coming loose on one side, a gray dress that had started life as something better. She was holding a small book in both hands, but she wasn't reading it. I should have gone back inside. I don't talk to people when I don't have to. It's not unfriendliness exactly, or maybe it is, but it's a kind that I came by honestly, and it served me well enough. Instead I said, "You stopped." She turned around and looked at me without startling, which I noticed. A lot of people startle when they find me behind them. She just turned and looked. "I was done," she said. She had brown eyes and a direct way of using them, not challenging, just looking, like she'd decided some time ago that looking straight at things was simpler than looking around them. "Your horse is in there," she said. It wasn't a question. "How'd you know?" "He started listening when I sang. He has good ears, the roan with the poultice." I thought about saying something dismissive. I said, "He does." She climbed down from the fence rail and straightened her skirt and looked at me again. "Is he going to be all right?" "Liveryman says 10 days. "Then you're stuck here." "That's one way to put it." "I'm stuck here too," she said. "Broken wheel on the second wagon." "Devereaux the preacher says 3 days. I suspect it's more." She paused. "I'm Lena Marsh." "Cal Britton." She didn't ask what I did, and I didn't offer it. She just nodded, and then she said, "I'm going to sing to him again tomorrow morning if that's all right with you." It seemed to help. And she walked away before I could answer. I went back into Reaper. He was still standing with his ears forward, though she was gone. "Don't read into it," I told him. It was the first time I'd talked to the horse in 22 years on the trail. She came back the next morning, and the morning after, and by the third morning Bernal had started leaving the back door of the livery unlatched for her. She'd sit on the fence outside Reaper's stall. She'd figured out which window faced which stall, and she'd sing for maybe half an hour, and he'd stand at the window and listen. I started coming to check on him at the same time, without meaning to think about why. We didn't talk much those first days. She wasn't a chatterer. I'd come in, check the leg, she'd be outside singing, and sometimes after she finished she'd come around to the front and we'd stand outside the stall and she'd look at the leg and ask how it felt to the touch, and I'd show her. She knew about horses. Turned out she'd grown up on a small ranch in the Texas Panhandle before it had been her husband's ranch, and then her late husband's ranch, and then the bank's ranch. And she'd left with what she could fit in a saddle roll, and found the preacher's outfit 6 months later and stayed. She told me this without drama, like she was reading off a list. I had the feeling she'd already done whatever grieving was necessary and had moved on to just carrying it. I told her nothing about myself on those first days. I listened. The third night, Devereaux held his revival in the church. because the tent was still folded in the broken wagon. I went because the hotel was louder. Some drover outfit had come in and taken over the saloon next door, and the music came right through the wall, and because I had nowhere else to be. Lena sang. She wasn't the only music. There was a man with a fiddle and a heavy-set woman who played the pump organ that the church owned, but when Lena sang, the room changed. I was in the last pew. I'd taken the aisle seat on the right, the habit of 22 years, and I could watch the door and I could watch her both, and I watched her. She sang 3 songs. The third one was the one I'd heard through the livery wall that first afternoon, the one about the river and the crossing. And on the word crossing she did that thing again, that door-opening break, and I felt it in my sternum like pressure applied from the inside. I looked down at my hands. They were folded on my knee, and they looked like they belonged to a man I'd been hired to bring in, once. A man who'd done hard things so long he'd forgotten they were hard. The skin across the knuckles was dry and cracked at the joints from the cold, and there was a scar on the right thumb from a knife fight in Laramie in 1871, and another on the heel of the palm that I'd stopped being able to remember the origin of. I didn't feel sorry for myself. I'm clear about that. It was more that the music had opened a window I didn't know was there, and cold air was coming in. She looked at me once, near the end of the third song. Not a performing look, not a seeking the crowd look. She found me in the last pew and held it for 1 beat, 2, and then she looked back at the front of the room and finished the song, and I had the peculiar feeling that she had seen something and filed it, and that was that. After, in the yard outside the church, people stood around in the cold the way they do, not quite ready to break up, the music still in them a little. I was standing apart from it near the fence when she came out and walked straight to me. "You stayed the whole time," she said. "Nowhere else to be." "That's not why." I didn't have an answer for that. She was right, but I wasn't going to say so. She looked at me in that direct way she had. "You're a bounty hunter." I'd wondered when it was coming. Word travels in small towns, and I'd had to show my papers at the sheriff's office when I came in. It's courtesy, marking your territory so the local law doesn't mistake you for a wanted man. "Who told you?" "Bernal. He didn't mean anything by it. He just mentioned it." "Does it change something?" She thought about it, which I appreciated. She didn't rush an answer. "It explains your hands," she said finally. I looked down at them. "My hands." "The way you hold them, like you're ready to use them, even in church." I didn't know what to say to that either. Nobody had ever looked at me close enough to notice a thing like that, or if they had, they'd kept it to themselves. "It's just habit," I said. "I know," she said. "Good night, Mr. Britton." She went back inside. I stood by the fence for a while in the cold, and then I walked back to the hotel and lay on the bed in the dark and stared at the ceiling and listened to the drovers in the saloon next door work their way through another bottle, and I thought about the word crossing and how it had gone right through the bone. On the 5th day, Reaper put weight on the leg. Bernal came and got me mid-morning, pleased in the careful way of a man who doesn't like to celebrate too early, and I came and watched while he walked the horse out and back, and the limp was there, but it was less, and Bernal said 7 days now instead of 10, if it kept on. Lena was there. She'd been sitting on the fence when I came around the back, and she climbed down and stood beside me while Bernal walked him. "He's stubborn," she said. "He didn't want to stay down." "No," I said, "he never has." "How long have you had him?" 9 years. She looked at the horse, then at me. "That's a long time on this kind of work." "It is." "He trusts you." "Mostly." "Does that go both ways?" I thought about that. Probably more him trusting me than the other direction. "I worry about him." "Because he can't tell you if something's wrong." "Because he takes the worst of what happens, and he doesn't get any of the pay." She made a small sound, not quite a laugh. not quite not, and looked away. That's a kinder thing to say than I'd have expected from a man people seem to find frightening. People find me frightening because it's useful. Doesn't mean I think it means anything. She was quiet for a moment, then, my husband was like that. People thought he was hard because he never showed much. He cried once the whole time I knew him. When the foal we'd been waiting on all spring didn't make it, he thought I was asleep. She paused. I wasn't asleep. I didn't say anything. I'm not trying to make a point, she said. I'm just saying I don't mistake quiet for empty. Bernal brought Reaper back and put him in the stall, and Lena patted the horse's nose for a minute, and then went back to whatever she'd been doing before. And I stood there with the smell of camphor and hay around me, and something in my chest that I didn't have a name for. That night I dreamed about the war. I hadn't done that in years. I'm not going to go into the particulars of the dream because they don't have any bearing on the rest of this, and because there are things I don't talk about still. But I woke up at 3 in the morning with the sheets wound around my legs and my heart doing something unreasonable, and I lay there and waited for it to stop, and after a while it did, the way it always does, and I got up and sat by the window in the cold and watched the street. Cimarron at 3 in the morning was a street and some sleeping windows and a dog that crossed from one side to the other on business of its own. There was a lamp burning in the church. I hadn't known anyone was over there. I put on my boots and my coat and walked over. She was sitting in the third pew from the front, not the front pew, which I'd noticed people rarely chose even when they had the whole church to themselves. She had the small book open on the pew beside her, but she wasn't reading. She heard me come in and looked back without alarm. I saw the light, I said. Couldn't sleep. She looked at the front of the church, the plain wooden cross nailed above where a proper altar would have been. Can you? Not tonight. She moved slightly on the pew, not an invitation exactly, but not one either. I sat down 2 feet from her on the same pew, which was more sociable than I generally am, and I looked at the cross the same way she had been. We sat there for a while without talking. I'm not sure how long enough for the church to stop feeling like a strange place to be in the middle of the night. What keeps you awake? She said. Not asked. Said like she already knew there was something and was giving me the space to decide whether to say it. Old things, I said. The war. I looked at her sideways. You're perceptive. You talk about your age without meaning to. And men your age who have gone quiet in certain ways, it's usually the war. I looked back at the cross. I was 19. I thought it would be the biggest thing I ever did one way or the other, that everything after would be smaller. I paused. It wasn't wrong. And this work, the tracking. It's what I had left that felt like it mattered, cleaning something up. Does it still feel that way? Some days more than others. She picked up the small book and turned it in her hands without opening it. I sing those songs at night sometimes, when I can't sleep, not for anyone. Just to put the feeling somewhere outside myself. What feeling? She was quiet for a moment. Like everything I was building toward is already done, like the rest is just waiting. She said it plainly, no drama, same way she'd told me about the ranch and her husband and the 6 months until she found the preacher's outfit. I know that's not a healthy thing. I'm not asking for argument. I wasn't going to argue, I said. I know that feeling. She looked at me. The waiting, I said, not knowing what you're waiting for. Just the days going by and you wake up and do the work and nothing's wrong exactly, but nothing's quite right either. I stopped. I hadn't said that to anyone. I hadn't even said it to myself that clearly. I've got a horse that might not make it to the next job, and a man I've been chasing for 11 days who's probably in New Mexico by now, and a room in a town I didn't mean to stop in, and I'm 44 years old. The words just came out. Like something that had been sitting in a locked box for a long time and the box had got wet and the wood had warped and the lock didn't hold anymore. She didn't respond right away. She looked at me the way she'd looked at me from the front of the church during the third song, steady, like she was seeing what was there, and not adding anything to it, and not taking anything away. Then she put her hand on my forearm. Not a gesture of, it wasn't pity. Her hand just settled there on my coat sleeve, the way you'd steady a table that was about to tip, and she left it there. 44 is not done, she said. I know that. You say it like you know it, she said, but you said all that like a man taking inventory before he sells the land. That was accurate, I didn't deny it. My husband died at 41, she said. There are things I'm sorry I didn't say. She didn't look away from me. I don't know you well, but I know you've been out on this trail a long time, and I know you look at your horse with more gentleness than you probably show anyone else, and I know you've been carrying something since the war that nobody ever helped you set down. She paused. I'm not saying I can fix that. I'm saying I've been sitting here looking at a wooden cross for an hour because I had the same feeling, and then you walked in. I didn't say anything for a long time. Outside, the dog crossed the street again, going back the way it had come. I don't know how to do this, I said, meaning whatever this was, the talking, the sitting, the hand on my arm and the sense that the locked box was open and the cold was coming in, and maybe cold was the wrong word for it. I know, she said, you've been by yourself a long time. It's not that I don't want, I started again. I didn't think anyone would bother. She looked at me. To look, I said. Past the dead-eye thing I've got going. She made that sound again, the almost laugh, and her hand on my arm tightened just slightly. The dead-eye thing, she said. That's what they call it in the territories. I know, Bernal told me that too. She paused. I looked past it the first morning. I don't know what you think you're hiding behind it, but it's not working, at least not on me. I looked at her. You've been kind to that horse, she said. Every morning I've watched you. You don't know I'm watching, but I am. You're not performing kindness for the horse. There's nobody there to perform for. That's who you are. She held my gaze. And I watched you in the church that night, and you sat in the last pew because you don't trust yourself among people anymore, but you stayed. You stayed the whole time. You sat there with your hands on your knee and your jaw set like you were waiting for bad news, and you stayed. I felt something go wrong with my face, not in a bad way. Something shifted that I couldn't have described and couldn't have stopped. Hey, she said quietly. I'm fine, I said. I know you are, she said. That's not what this is. And she was right. Whatever came then, and I'll tell you straight, because that's the only way I know to tell this, that my eyes burned and I had to look up at the ceiling of that church for a moment. It wasn't falling apart. It was more like the door that had been stuck for 20 years deciding all at once to open. Not a bad thing. Just open. I sat there in the third pew of a church in Cimarron with a woman's hand on my arm, and whatever came up, and she didn't look away, and she didn't say anything, and she didn't make it into something it wasn't. She just sat there, steady, the way the very best people can be. And after a while, the thing passed through, and I was still there, and so was she. I said, I don't usually. I know, she said. Nobody's ever. I stopped again. I know, she said again, gently, like she was used to men arriving at this sentence and not being able to finish it. We sat there until the lamp started to gutter. Then she turned it up and we sat there a while longer, and at some point we started talking about ordinary things, about horses, about the panhandle, about whether Briggs was likely to be in New Mexico or had doubled back south toward the territory. And the ordinary things felt different than ordinary things usually feel, because there was something under them now, a layer that hadn't been there before. I walked her back to the preacher's wagon at 4 in the morning. At the wagon she turned and looked at me. I'm not a settled woman, she said. I want to tell you that plain. I've been on the road 6 months and I might be on it 6 more. I don't have a house or land or anything to offer in that direction. I don't have a house either, I said. I've got a hotel room and a lame horse. So we're well matched, she said. Something I can only call warmth moved through me. The particular kind that takes you by surprise because you'd forgotten the temperature was capable of that. I don't know what happens after Cimarron, I said. Neither do I. But I'd like to find out. She held my gaze for a moment, that steady, direct look, and then she nodded once, the way a person nods when they've already thought it through and the answer isn't going to change. Yes, she said. So would I. She went into the wagon and I walked back through the cold street to the hotel and lay down on the bed, and the drovers next door were finally quiet, and I stared at the ceiling and felt the open door and the cold coming in, and I let it. The second morning after that, Reaper walked without any limp at all. I was there when it happened. Bernal brought him out and walked him up and back, and on the second pass the horse moved clean and easy, and Bernal said he was satisfied, and I put my hand on the horse's neck, and he turned and breathed on my palm the way he had in the creek, and I stood there in the morning light in Cimarron feeling something that was not triumphant but not far from it. Lena was on the fence. She'd come every morning and she was there now, and when Reaper walked clean she said quietly, "There he is," and the horse heard her and turned toward the fence. I looked at her on the fence in the morning light, the brown hair coming loose on one side the same as always, the gray dress, the small book tucked under her arm, the direct brown eyes. "When does the preacher move on?" I said. "Tomorrow maybe, day after. And Briggs is south, maybe 2 weeks behind him now." "Yes. A man could ride south and come around," I said, "if he was willing to lose a few days." She looked at me. "He could. The outfit Devereaux's, does it winter somewhere, or does it keep moving?" "Tucson," she said. "We winter in Tucson." Tucson was not out of my way. Nothing was really out of my way, given that my way had never been anything more specific than the next Dodger and the next trail. I went around and checked Reaper's leg one more time, running my hand down the tendon, feeling for heat or swelling and finding neither, and then I looked up at Lena on the fence and she was watching me with the horse, not making a sound, just watching, and I thought about what she'd said in the church in the middle of the night, that she'd been watching me every morning with the horse, and that was who I was, the man the horse showed without an audience there to perform for. Nobody had ever seen me that way. It sounds like nothing, maybe. But I was 44 years old, and I had been moving through the world for 22 years, in such a way that the only creature that ever got the unperformed version of me was a roan gelding named Reaper, and this woman on a fence in Cimarron had been watching the whole time. I stood up and dusted my hands and looked at her. "I'll ride south," I said. "Tucson in 6 weeks, give or take." She nodded. "I'll tell Devereaux you might need board for a horse." "Tell him I'll pay." "He won't charge you," she said. "He's not as righteous as he looks. He'll like having a bounty hunter around, better than a deacon." I almost smiled. I could feel myself almost doing it. She climbed down from the fence and walked past me on her way back through the livery, and she put her hand flat on my chest, just for a moment, just the pressure of it through the coat, and then she kept walking, and I stood there in the morning light with Reaper's breath warm against my neck and the sound of her footsteps fading toward the street. I rode south 3 days later. I caught Denton Briggs in the foothills outside Las Cruces, alive the way the contract required, and brought him back to Pueblo by the end of November and collected what was owed. And then I turned south again and rode through country that went from brown to pale gold to the particular dusty green of the desert coming into winter. And I thought about a woman on a fence rail singing to a horse that was going to be fine. And I rode. Tucson in December is cold at night, but the days are long and clear, and I found the preacher's outfit on the western edge of town, the wagons in a yard behind a mission. Bernal had written ahead for me. His cousin ran a livery in Tucson, and it turned out Bernal wrote more letters than I'd have guessed from a man who ran a livery in Cimarron. Lena was in the mission yard when I came in off the road. She saw me across the yard, and she looked at me the way she'd looked at me through the church in Cimarron during the third song, directly, steadily, and she walked toward me with her hands free at her sides, not rushing, not performing, just walking. I stepped off the horse. She stood in front of me. 6 weeks, she said. 6 and 2 days, I said. How's Reaper? He's good. Sound the whole way. She turned and looked at the horse and then back at me, and she looked at me the way she'd looked at me in the livery that first morning, the way that went past the surface and kept going, and then she put both hands on the sides of my face, not gentle, not rough, just certain. And she looked at me like that for a moment with the December sun behind her and the smell of the desert and horse and the last of the road on me, and she said, quietly and plainly, like she was reading off a list of things she knew to be true, "I'm glad you came back." And that was it, that was the whole thing. I've thought about it a lot since. About what exactly it was that happened in Cimarron, and why it landed the way it did. Why a woman singing to my horse through a livery wall did something to me that 11 days of hard trail had not. Why a hand on a coat sleeve in a church at 3 in the morning opened a door that 22 years of being alone had locked. I think it was just that she looked. Not through me, not past me, not at the useful version of me or the dangerous version of me or the version you keep on hand to bring a man back alive. Just at me. Cal Britton with the dry, cracked hands and the war behind his eyes and the horse that trusted him more than he trusted anything, the man who sat in the last pew and stayed the whole time. I was 51 when I got off the trail for good. We had a small place outside Tucson by then, near the mission, not land enough for a ranch but enough for a garden and a proper stall for Reaper and a porch that faced west. Lena still sang sometimes in the evenings, not for church, just for the air, and the horse would come to the fence, and I would sit on the porch and let it come through me the same way it had through that livery wall the first afternoon, and I would think, this is it. This is what the door was for. I don't know how to say the rest of it except plainly. I had been a long time in the cold is all, and someone opened the door, and the thing is, she knew I was in there. That's all, that's the whole story. Reaper died in the spring of 1889, old for a horse, in the stall we'd built for him, with the early morning coming through the small window I'd put in the east wall so it would catch the light. I'd known it was coming for a week. I sat with him through the night before, the last night, and somewhere around 4 in the morning Lena came out in her coat and sat beside me on the straw and didn't say anything and put her shoulder against mine, and we stayed like that until it was done. Afterward she said, he was a good horse. He was, I said. He knew, she said, he always knew. I didn't ask what she meant. I think she meant that he knew, all those years ago in a creek bed outside Cimarron with a pulled tendon and a tired man standing in the water, that something was about to change. That the getting lame was the beginning of it, not just a setback on a trail that didn't lead anywhere worth going. Could be, he always had better sense than I did. The morning light was coming through the window I'd built him, and Lena's shoulder was against mine. And the desert was doing what it does in early spring, which is to go from gray to the particular pale gold that is the best color in the world if you've lived long enough to know what it costs to see it. I sat there in the good light and I let it.